Hello, everyone. I'm sorry. I'm going to start from the top again as we deal with our technical difficulties, but I think that we're all ready to go now. So to start again, I'm Janet Jacobson. I'm the co-director of the Barnard Center for Research on Women this year with my good colleague, Premilla Nadasen. And this event, Listening to the Archives, Movements Against Women's Imprisonment, is with our colleagues at the Barnard Archives, and we're doing a series of events this fall with the Barnard Archives. So we hope that you will be able to join us for this, not just this event, but the two following. For tonight, we have several people to thank. We want to thank the people who brought this together. Here at BCRW, that would include Miriam Neptune, Avi Cummings, Sophie Kreitzberg, and our BCRW RA working tonight, Nilu Cooper, and Hope Dector, who is also helping with the tech this evening. We also want to thank our ASL interpreters, Lisa Dennett and Carly Aelise from All Hands in Motion, and our captioner, Trish Aldrich from Total Caption. Live transcription is available at the link in the chat and in the YouTube description. Now I want to introduce to you our colleague, Obden Mondésir, who is the Associate Director of the Barnard Archives and an adjunct lecturer at Queens College in the City University of New York. Obden has been crucial in developing this program and the work in the archives on which it is based, and will serve as your host for this evening. Just to give you a little bit of background on Obden's work, Obden is an oral history practitioner, and in that, as a practitioner, he has led the project on the Sikh History Project, which documented the rich history of the Queens College Percy Ellis Sutton Sikh program, with a focus on the Sikh Rebellion of 1968-1969, as well as subsequent joys and challenges experienced by faculty, staff, and students of the program over its 55-year existence. Obden has also conducted and presented on several community-based oral history projects that have focused on education, Black joy, and Black-owned restaurants in central Brooklyn. Obden has a dual MA in library science and history from Queens College, and is the recipient of a West African Research Center Library Fellowship and the City Center for Culture and Queens Library Fellowship. In other words, we are very lucky that Obden works with us here at Barnard, and that Obden will serve as our host for this evening and introduce the rest of our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet, for that introduction. And hello, everyone. Thank you for attending Listening to the Archive, Movements Against Women's Imprisonment. We're excited to have in conversation 3 former members of the Coalition for Women Prisoners. The coalition, founded in 1994, brought together organizations and individuals from across New York State to raise the visibility of women impacted by the criminal legal system, and to organize against the gendered harms of incarceration. The CWP decided to sunset in 2021, and several members have generously donated materials to Barnard, all of which collectively make up the CWP collection. Throughout its history, the CWP has been instrumental in advancing policy initiatives that improve material conditions for people in prison. They organize alongside broader coalitions to enact several key pieces of New York State legislation, including the anti-shackling law to prohibit the shackling of incarcerated pregnant people, the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act to protect criminalized survivors of domestic violence, and the Halt Solitary Bill to limit the use of solitary confinement in New York State prisons. The CWP integrated its organizing for a structural level change with everyday work to meet the immediate needs of incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women. In 2003, the Women in Prison Project launched Reconnect, an advocacy and leadership program for women returning home from incarceration. The program worked simultaneously to support participants in their transition out of prison, while also cultivating skills for organizing and activism, providing an on-ramp to the CWP's advocacy work. As its works progressed, the CWP centered the leadership of formerly incarcerated women whose narratives, writing, and organizing work are present across the collection's material. The three panelists that we have today also have given oral history testimonies where they discussed their experience while working with the CWP. And the aforementioned collection was processed by the wonderfully passionate student associate and research assistant, Eve Glazier. So the finding aid for this collection is, or can be found on our website at archives.barnard.edu with the records available either in person or remotely via request. Now I'm going to introduce our panelists for tonight's discussion. And the first person I would like to introduce is Raya Mallet. So Raya Mallet became the director for the Women in Prisons Project in 1994 and founded the coalition and was its director from 1994 to 1996. She is an experienced attorney with broad experience that includes a background in government and politics, having worked for the mayor of New York City, as well as a private law firm, nonprofit agencies, and political campaigns. A graduate of Amherst College and Columbia University Law School, she is currently completing an LLM at Pace University's Elizabeth Hobbs School of Law, while practicing as an environmental lawyer specializing in land use.
Good evening, Obden.
Hey, good evening. And now I would like to introduce Anissa Sabour. Anissa Sabour has been a policy advocate for the past 18 years. She is one of the lead organizers of the New York Coalition of Women Prisoners, a group whose members included incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women and allies. She also advises several foundations on the impact of incarceration and building the leadership of women involved in the criminal legal system. Anissa continues prison monitoring with the Correctional Association of New York team. Anissa is the founder of the AASE Empowerment LLC, where she trains directly impacted women in policy advocacy and organizing.
Good evening, everyone.
Yes. All right. And finally, I would like to introduce Andrea Williams. They are the Director of Community Engagement of the Legal Action Center. Andrea develops, leads, and manages LAC's agency-wide community engagement strategies, and they also coordinate the LGBTQI ATI Reentry Working Group. They are a lawyer, advocate, and leadership coach who has committed their life to building power and voice among those directly impacted by systemic oppression. Prior to joining LAC, Andrea worked with the Survivor-Centered Advocacy Project at Rising Ground's STEPS, STEPS, to end family violence program. From 2004 to 2019, they were a member of the Correctional Association of New York's Women in Prison Project, where they directed advocacy and leadership training for women returning home from incarceration and assisted with the organization's prison monitoring and coalition building work. Andrea has a JD from Rutgers School of Law, Newark, a MA in the Humanities from Atlanta University, and a BA in Political Science from Boston University.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone.
Yeah. All right, great. It's a pleasure to introduce and have you all tonight. And the way that we wanted this conversation to go is that we have 4 topics that we wanted to discuss. 3 of the topics will begin with an audio clip that was pulled from interviews that we collected in the past few months. And then I will direct a question to the group that we will answer. And before that, I will make sure to describe the clip and put it in its proper context. And after that, we will have, at the end of the 4 topics, we will have a Q&A with questions pulled from the audience. All right. Great. So the first audio clip that I wanted to share is from the interview that we had with Anissa, where in this clip, it is a discussion or a piece where Anissa talks about being incarcerated in the early 2000s and having a realization and a recognition of the generational harm that she experienced and saw while incarcerated. So Hope, if you could play the first audio clip.
State, I started to see an influx of young people. And my head was really clear. Because then I started asking them, why are you here? What are you doing here? And they started telling me, that's my mom, and that's my grandma, and I'm here. And I'm like, this is generations of women incarcerated. What the hell is happening? And so most of them were there for either having drugs in their house, being caught up in a sweep, buying drugs, something to do with drugs. And this was the influx of the crack epidemic, right? And so just really looking at them and saying, my God, what's happening with my own child? She can be my daughter, she can be my daughter, she can be my daughter, right? And so that just really inspired me to start kind of journaling and writing, like where I am, what's happening, what I'm seeing, why is this happening? You know, asking all these questions to myself. What could I do differently when I get out of here?
Okay. Thank you, Hope. So the first question that I wanted to address to the group is, could you first tell me about how you initially became involved with the CWP? And what do you think that people should know about how different the worldview, languages, and issues that affected women's incarceration in New York City during the 90s and 2000s compared to now? And I guess the first person I'll ask to start is Anissa, as Anissa, the clip featured you.
Okay, thank you so much, Obden. Wow. The impact, right? And how I became involved in the Correctional Association is because of my own experience, as you heard from the clip. I really started to think about what I could do differently. And when I heard about the Correctional Association's Reconnect project, I went and I applied because, one, I thought it was a job for people who had actually been incarcerated, and I was really looking for employment. But I felt like I stumbled onto a pot of gold, right? When I applied for it, you know, my mind was all about what I spoke about in the interview is, how can I help the young people from getting into where I was at, right? How do I break this cycle, right? And so and Andrea might remember this, I remember my application interview, I talked all about how I wanted to be this person to help our young people not be in the situation that I was in. Mm. And really not knowing and understanding what advocacy was really all about, or how to use my own experience to help guide someone in a different direction. And so once I was accepted into Reconnect, it was just off to the races from there. And for me, I think that, you know, that really helped me to understand my situation and then to be able to share that with others to help them along their path. And that's why I do the work that I do now.
And Anissa, thank you so much for that. The next person I'm going to ask is Rhea.
Sure. Thank you. It's such a privilege to be here with everybody. I think I'd like to set the stage of what was happening in the late 80s, early 90s when the Coalition for Women Prisoners just began. We had in New York State mandatory sentencing laws. We had both the Rockefeller drug laws, which created the severest penalties in the country for possession of a relatively small amount of drugs and or buying or selling a small amount of drugs. And we also had what was known as the second felony offender law, which required a mandatory minimum state prison sentence for anyone convicted of a felony for the second time within 10 years. And because of these two laws, the women became the fastest growing segment of the prison population in New York State during this initial time period, to the point that I remember from the late 80s to the early 90s, second felony offenders who were women, the women's sentence as second felony offenders increased by nearly 300% in that time period. So these laws contributed to the increasing incarceration of women, and they also fueled racial disparities that have come to characterize our criminal justice system, because, you know, more than 90% of these women being incarcerated were Black or Latinx. So that was what was happening when the Coalition for Women Prisoners first began. All of a sudden, New York State had this exponential increase of women being sent to prison.
So I'll jump in. Honored to be here with everyone. I came to the coalition from work in AIDS policy advocacy. Prior to joining the Correctional Association, I had worked at the HIV Law Project and also had done some work at the New York AIDS Coalition, an organization that existed at the time. And then I left to do some travel and some consulting, and I came back and I was looking for a job. And the Women in Prison Project was looking for someone to run Reconnect. Reconnect at that point had one pilot class in 2003. Denise Andrade was the person who was the coordinator for Reconnect. She was moving on. And so they were looking for somebody to kind of pick it up and grow the program. So I applied and I got the job and I started building out the program. So that's how I came to the coalition and the Correctional Association. And I want to say, just to add to context, that what I feel I brought was what I was exposed to in the AIDS advocacy, which at the HIV Law Project, they had a very strong, longstanding advocacy training program for women who were living with HIV and AIDS. And a number of the women who were graduates of that program had come out of Bedford Hills, and they were organized by the Law Project to really be a voice and a face for women who were affected by HIV and AIDS. And so when I was at the HIV Law Project, I had coordinated that program and met many, many strong advocates and community organizers and policy advocates. And so I was able to kind of bring my learnings and experience from that work to help build out a program for women affected by incarceration with Reconnect and with the work of the coalition. So that's how I came to be involved.
All right, cool. Thank you so much for your responses in regards to like how you became involved with it, and also describing like what was happening at the time during your entry into the program, especially from the 90s into the early 2000s. And I think the next clip that we're going to play I think, discuss further in depth, Rhea, more of the beginnings of the CWP, and from there I'll include some more questions. So Hope, could you play the second clip? Well, first, before you play the second clip, I would like to provide some context. It's an interview that we conducted with Rhea, and during this interview, Rhea describes in 1994 or 1993-94 when Rhea applied for the job, and describing the preparation to get the position for the Women in Prisons Project to become the director, and also how that began the Coalition for Women Prisoners. So now, Hope, if you could play the clip.
If you were going to become the director of the Women Prison Project, you were tasked with creating a coalition for women prisoners. And by the way, this was at a time where there were so many people doing the work. I was definitely not the first one, but people were not necessarily working together. So I created this big spreadsheet, and my now husband at the time, he said, well, why don't you bring that to the interview? I thought, I can't bring this to the interview. He goes, yeah, you can. You have it all charted out. So I rewrote it so it was neater, and I actually found it, and I saved it. And when you look at it, you can see that the very first thing is the Coalition for Women Prisoners. How am I going to do this? And chart is 12 months, and it lays out each of the 4 objectives they wanted the person in who became the director of the Women Prison Project, how we're going to achieve all of this in 12 months. So when I just focusing on the Coalition for Women Prisoners, the idea was that I would immediately set up an advisory council. I would create a meeting within the first third of the year. It would be run by committees. That by 3 quarters into the first year, we would begin a public education and media campaign. And by the end of the first year, we would be lobbying for change. And this is literally the blueprint of what we did that first year. So the good news is I got hired, and I remember walking into an interview. It was with Bob Ganji and a board member, I don't remember who. The Correctional Association at the time was a townhouse on, I think, East 15th Street, might have been 14th, but near Union Square. And so you walked up the brownstone steps, right? It was like a brownstone, and the conference room was in the back where like a dining room would be. And I remember my interview because it's what I wanted, and I left with this tucked under my arm. And so why do I still have this so many years later? This document was so important to me because this was my Super Bowl, right? Getting this job. And looking at it now, and I haven't looked at it in decades, and seeing that we actually did what I had said I would do during the interview is it's exciting and satisfying.
Thank you, Hope.
Do you want me to go first?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first thing I wanted to mention is Rhea, if you could go into more depth in regards to that clip. And the question that I was going to pose to everyone, and I'll allow you to go first, is to describe some of the accomplishments that occurred during your time that you are proud of.
Sure, thank you. So that's why I saved my origin story for right now and didn't say it before. I have always wanted to do prison reform work since high school because I recognized the injustices that were happening in our criminal justice system, and I didn't understand as a young adult why or how it could be, and it was so obvious to me. And I knew I wanted to be a public defender, so I knew about the Women in Prison projects. I was doing a lot of work as a young attorney, a lot of volunteer work with women in prison. And when this job opened, like Anissa had experienced, it was, this is what I have to do. So that's probably why I saved that document, because I couldn't believe I got the job. It was thrilling to be a part of the Women in Prison Project and to help start the Coalition for Women Prisoners. And the context I gave before will explain why I'm going to pick a couple of accomplishments to share with you in those initial first years. The prison system didn't know what to do with women. Women were invisible. They were treated like men in the beginning. And it's hard to imagine, but if you go back, one of my biggest successes had to do with clothing. When you visited women who were incarcerated at the time, they would talk about how their clothing didn't fit. And it turned out that when the women entered the system, they just started giving them the same clothing that they had been giving to men all these years. So it didn't take legislation. It just took some, advocacy with the prison administration, and we were able to change the clothing within months that the women were wearing in the New York State system. And this was so important for two reasons. One, it was an acknowledgement by prison officials and by the administration and really society that women were being incarcerated. They had to start addressing the needs of women. And the second aspect where I think the change in clothing was so important was because what does clothing say about who we are, what we wear every day? The new clothing made women realize they were no longer invisible, which is essentially, I think, how they felt before. And just real quickly, a second administrative change that we were able to get done all within the first few months, definitely within the first year, was back then, in order to change a phone number on your list of approved calls, you had to wait 90 days. So mothers who, if their child moved to a new caretaker or moved to a different school, could have to wait up to 90 days to actually speak to their child or their child's caretaker. And when we brought that to the attention of the prison administrators, very quickly they changed the list. But again, this is, forcing the prison administration to acknowledge that now this New York State system was locking up not just women, but primary caretakers. Mothers were being separated, and the needs of mothers was very different than what prison officials to that point were used to.
Thank you for that, Rhea. And now I'm going to pose a question to Anissa. Would you like to share some of the accomplishments that you're proud of during your time with the CWP?
Thank you. It's too long of a list to go through. Like I said, I've been doing this for the last 18 years, and I am really proud of all of the work and the accomplishments that the CWP has made, beginning with when I returned home. The first policy I worked on with the CWP was the Drop the Rock, the Rockefeller drug laws, right? Which was a great impact on my life because I was somebody who was sentenced under the Rockefeller drug laws. So definitely that one, but there was many more. There was the ASFA law, expanding the cap for family members not to lose their parental rights while they were incarcerated. The anti-shackling, you talked a little bit about that, and what really inspired me more about that one was that we got to do that twice and make it stronger so that no pregnant woman should ever be shackled again. And the last thing that I worked on was the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act, which I am proud to say that I am still following and tracking the implementation of that, and knowing that the bill is actually doing what we designed it to do for those survivors who are harshly sentenced in New York State. So it's a long list of accomplishments, and I'm most proud of all of them because I know the lead in all of that work were women who had experienced some form of incarceration, especially those who were criminalized survivors with the DVSJA.
So I'll jump in again. It's, there's many things that I could say. For me, I'm most proud of building a program with a team and with the support of the members of the coalition that really built a strong cadre of previously incarcerated women, leaders, and advocates in New York State who were the voices and the faces on, the issues that we're talking about here, the policy issues that we're talking about here. And there's so many stories about how, we were able to do that together. I remember when I interviewed with Tamar for the position, she mentioned that they weren't sure that that the leadership training could even get off the ground. They had a program, it was 10 weeks. And in working with Stacey Thompson, who at the time was the coalition coordinator, we were really able to form relationships with the organizations that the women who were incarcerated would come home to: Women's Prison Association, Green Hope Services for Women, Providence House, and start to meet the women and form relationships with them, and the vocational counselors who would allow them to participate in Reconnect and participate in the coalition. Folks would come to the meetings and really just start to build community, a community of advocates that way. We built a brand. There was a group of us who worked together with a graphic designer and with a communication specialist to create the logo and to create the brochure and the application. Eventually, we were able to build in a program of peer leaders who could work to support the program and work as interns with the Women in Prison Project and help Stacey. And eventually also Anissa was one of those people for many, many years, right? To help set up the meetings and to do the or new member orientation and to serve as the lobby leaders and to help train, other women who were interested in going on the big lobby days that we did. So I if I had to put in a nutshell the one accomplishment, I was able we had 200 women over my 14 years with Reconnect complete the Reconnect program. And a number of those women are out here, they're running their own organizations and businesses and playing a role in the community, resuming the role in their families and all of that, and continuing to support other people impacted by incarceration. And I'm often reminded, I was recently talking to someone who I'm doing some work with now, about how she still uses the information in the big notebooks that we would have, and just is connected with the community co-trainers who would come in, which is the whole point of having community co-trainers, so that people could build a network, right, of folks in the community to get information, to work with, to be in community with, to be in relationship with. So I'm just proud of all of that work that we were able to do together. I learned so much myself and continue to learn so much from that work and from the people, every person that I was working with. And I work every day to try to pull those learnings and those lessons forward and continuing to build, right, and do the movement work.
Yeah, thank you for those responses. And a follow-up question that I wanted to ask is, like, during these conversations, one of the things that came up, and I think this question is going to be first directed at Rhea, is that, like, there was an emphasis of understanding what it took to do that organizing work, especially in the 90s. Would you like to take out some time to describe, like, the process of like working with a coalition as large as the one that the CWP had?
Okay, Obden, you're gonna make me sound very, very old because in the 90s, we couldn't organize through email and Facebook and social media. So we had these amazing staff people, Laura Davidson and Vanessa Benavides. They helped, and we did everything by snail mail. All of our meetings were not on Zoom, but we had to get huge spaces because in the very first year, the very first meeting, we had 70 or 80 people at that meeting. So it was very laborious to get people together. It was phone and paper, which really is testimony to how important an issue this is to so many people. Now, because I was at the beginning of the coalition, I'm so glad it expanded into having more inclusion of formerly incarcerated women. That wasn't at the beginning when we were getting it off the ground. It was out community members, and we didn't have that. But people said it couldn't be done, but it did, because of people like Anissa and like Andrea, because of everybody who was ever a member of the Coalition for Women Prisoners. We gave a population a voice at a time when it was greatly needed.
I can echo your point about the labor, because even in the middle, all I have to do is say the lobby packet, right? When we were organizing our lobby days, we would have 6 or 7 buses of folks going up to Albany for our lobby day, and we had to put together material and organize that material into packets and do the training to make sure that everybody got on the bus, was trained, and had their packets and had the checklist and all of that. And I kind of missed that, because that is true blue organizing.
Yes.
That's collective learning. It's collective work and responsibility. And then you go up and you meet those electeds. And the lobby days were huge, and they were profound. The way we had champions in the legislature that supported us and helped us, Jeffrey and Aubrey, Delmanette Montgomery, and many others. People would bring family members, their children. For many people, it was the first time being in a government building, talking to an elected official. And there's so much power in that, right? Folks hadn't necessarily seen themselves doing that and in that space. And it would say all the time that it was a game changer. The one thing that people would say is the closest I thought I would get to the state office building was on that bus going up to Albion Correctional Facility. And it was an honor to be a part of that experience with people. There are many people from many walks of life who don't necessarily go and talk to their elected official, right? And so, and to see minds changed of elected officials, understanding start to happen when they were meeting with folks who walked the road and lived in the communities that were affected by mass incarceration, say, listen, this is what we need. This is what we need you to do for us. It's just a very, very powerful experience. And so there was a lot of labors of love in that organizing work. So.
Yeah. All I'm doing is saying yes, because I am the person who Andrea is talking about. It's hundreds of us, but I know for me, that was the moment that I knew that my life had changed. When they took me on that bus and took me to Albany for the first time, and I actually sat down with the legislature and shared my experience about being criminalized for being a substance user, and I made that individual cry by telling my story, I knew he listened to me. I knew he heard me, and I knew he would vote to give us money to open more treatment centers versus sending people to be in jail or in prison. And so I never thought that that could happen as somebody who was impacted by incarceration. I mean, working with the coalition, not even working, but just being a volunteer in it gave me so much inspiration and so much motivation to change my own lifestyle, right? That I couldn't turn away. No matter where I went or what I did, I spoke about the coalition and the work that it was doing. I love doing the community outreach with other members of the coalition and sharing my own experiences, but really sharing about the impact of incarceration and criminalization of women and getting people to listen to us. If it wasn't in substance programs that provided services to formerly incarcerated women, it could have been houses of worship where people just didn't really understand, or they was afraid to talk about, criminalization in their own congregation or in their family members. Members of the congregation would always come up to us after we finished presenting and would come over to us and say, I never knew that they had locked up women, but my son is locked up. My grandson is locked up. It was always the men, right, that they knew about the incarceration, but they didn't know about the women. And so in being able to engage them in that, it was so motivating and really freeing for me, for people to really understand that, we make mistakes, but we don't have to live in those mistakes. And the coalition really gave a lot of us who was directly impacted the route to our voice, right? And so I'm gonna always and forever be grateful to the Women in Prison Project and all of the coalition members that I can stay in contact with and hopefully build new members, not in the coalition, but in arenas that women can then be them advocates for themselves and those who are still incarcerated.
Yes, thank you for that. And both your comments, Anisah and Andrea, really dovetail into the next clip, which features Andrea, where Andrea discusses in depth a little more like what these advocacy days were like, and the importance that it brought to members that were part of the coalition. So Hope, if you could share the third clip.
Going to Albany and talk to the electeds was the golden ticket. It was the thing that everybody, including women who were home, loved to do. They would come to meetings, people would come to meetings regularly, and we had general meetings and we had committee meetings. Whenever we had an advocacy day, that's when we would get really just people from the community and Women in Reconnect, people who were in the programs, the transitional services programs would come, because I would hear people say things like, the closest that I came to the state capitol was on the bus on the way to Albion. I think it's just one of those experiences where it was such an eye-opener for people who were disconnected for whatever reason, by incarceration, by drug addiction, by whatever the issue challenge that they had, and never had a chance, an opportunity to talk to their elected representative in a way that people were really listening and cared about what they had to say. And then they could see the influence that they were having, right? We had great allies in Assemblyman Jeff Aubrey, Senator Velmanette Montgomery, Senator Ruth Hassel Thompson, And then we would meet Senator Tom Duane when he was in. Like, there were folks who got it, and then folks who started to get it the more that they met people in the coalition, and we were able to press our platform. And it just was such a powerful, empowering experience for people. Even you can see it, even just being with people like that. The advocacy days just got to be a thing for everybody because they were so powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Ooh.
I have a point to add, and that is our friend, coalition member, and comrade, Kathy Boudin, who recently passed, would say, you know, one of the great things about the coalition is that women would have a community and a space to come into right away when they came home, right? Because the Women in Prison Project was able, we did the monitoring in the women's prisons, and we had privileged mail status. We would answer letters, we would answer calls. And so we were able to sometimes send people information in about what was going on with the coalition, and people could write us and find out what was going on, and we can answer questions. We could tell people on monitoring visits about reconnects. If they were coming home, they could contact us if they wanted to apply and get involved. You know, we could have a real information sharing even before people came back to the community. And there was a community of advocates that people could immediately kind of join and get support and start to get involved with right away. And so that was also a very powerful thing, because you'd come to a meeting and then someone they just were home, and they could have a group of people say, welcome home, you know, and they could get support. And you know, the coalition was meeting so regularly and its work was so regular that, you know, folks could still do the things that they needed to do to meet their immediate life needs, but they could also really get support with information. A number of the folks, they were in the programs that were also part of the coalition. And we had social workers and we had counselors, and, you know, there was peer support. So I think it was just a great space where I'm hoping that, and I think it is true, I saw that people were really held. And no shame. This is another huge thing. I'm going to pick up on a point that Anissa was making, where a number of the women would talk about the fact that whether it was in a jail or a prison, they might, if they got arrested or they were incarcerated, you know, the officers would say, well, what are you doing here? There was a sense that women should not be caught up in the criminal legal system, right? And so there was a very deep sense of shame among a number of the women. They would just kind of, it was stigmatizing in their families, it was stigmatizing among their community members. And then they, you know, in prison, you get comments from the guards about, like, what are you doing here? You shouldn't be here. Like, what kind of woman are you, kind of thing. And so to have a space where people could come and step into the kind of leaderly role that they wanted, right? To have in the community, I think was also really, really important. And to have people supporting them that did not stigmatize, that tried to offer support, that saw a person and what a person had accomplished and what they were continuing to kind of try to accomplish in the community in their way, I think was an important part of the space that we had in the coalition.
Andrea, thank you for adding to that point. And a question that I wanted to add on to that is that what I find fascinating about the CWP and the work that was done is that through this creation of community in doing like this incredibly difficult labor, it challenged the atomization that like occurred by folks who were incarcerated. And the question that I wanted to bring up is, initially when I asked about like legislation and accomplishments that folks were proud of, I wanted to also ask about relationships that you developed during the CWP that you think are important, worth mentioning in this conversation.
You want to go first, Andrea? Because I got a whole list of relationships.
No, please, you can go.
So I can start with the relationships in the legislature, because for somebody like me to be able to pick up a phone today and call Assemblyman Aubrey, call Senator Ruth Hassel Thompson, who is no longer in the Senate, but still doing governmental work, right? And say, hey, I got a question about a policy I'm working on, and feed it out to them and get some really good feedback, right? To me, that's a relationship. To have Senator Ruth Hassel Thompson reach out to me and say, hey, Anissa, I'm doing a speaking engagement, so and so and so, come join me. And I go and show up, and it seems like to her, it's her most proudest moment to talk to the people in the room about the coalition and my leadership in the coalition, right? It's just so many. And then to think about my peers, right? Sisters in the movement, I call them today, right? Who we were in Reconnect together, right? And as Andrea said, we have now all developed into these professional people doing this great work in our communities. Two people that come to my mind right now is Lorraine Patterson, who her and I, we went through Reconnect together. We struggled to get employment together. We went back to school together, and we're doing what we need to do in the communities, right? Lorraine right now is a substance use counselor in a New York City hospital. I'm doing this policy work, right? And I'm also still training other people to be leaders as myself. The other person is Sharon Ray Harrigan. We all went through the same Reconnect class, right? Went through school, did our work, worked in different organizations. Sharon is now the director of an organization, right? And also building a similar group to the coalition, but it's considered a task force. When COVID struck, she called together all of her peers and said, what can we do to help the women who are currently incarcerated? How can we start to decarcerate and get our sisters out before they start dying from this pandemic? And it's still going on, right? To this day, we're still looking at ways to help women and reach back on the inside and help the sisters who are incarcerated. So I have a lot of relationships that I've built over the years, but those are just two of people who are with me and legislators who I still stay close to today. So I think those relationships, I don't think will ever end, but will continue to inspire me to do the work that I do. There's many more, but I don't want to take up more time. I want to make sure I save time for my comrades.
So I'll jump in here just to talk a little bit about the lobbying that both Anissa and Andrea have brought up, and in terms of relationships as well. I can admit it now, I think, a quarter of a century later. When I was told to organize that very first lobbying day, I had no idea what it meant. I had never spoken to an elected. Mm-hmm. So the beauty in that was I didn't know there were limitations. I remember in my idea, oh, it's a lobby day. It has to be really big, and let's try to have a goal. So the goal will be 100 meetings in one day. After I started organizing it with help from interns, we didn't have as many people as you guys had in the later years. It was very few people. So interns helped me, and of course the staff of the CA, and we started getting it all set up. And I remember Bob Ganji at the time looked at it and said, whoa, when we go lobbying, we bring 10 people. Like, so the fact that I didn't know what it was enabled us to make a very big splash that first day. And I can't tell you how amazing it is to hear that you leaders made it 6 buses. We had 1 bus the first year, but you made it 6 buses and 7 buses and brought all those women who were in the system back up for the other side is just incredible to hear. And I just want to share one relationship story. For us back in the 90s, one of the there were a lot of assembly members and senators who immediately got it, just like Anissa was saying, and understood the importance of doing the right thing, let's say. And one of them was Assembly Member Joe Lentil, who served in the Assembly from the 1970s until last year. And he immediately, back in 1995, sponsored or co-sponsored a bill that would help eliminate the mandatory restrictions of the Rockefeller drug laws, which took many years after that to pass. But I did see him in 2019 in Albany when I was lobbying for something else. And I took him aside and I said, remember the beginning of the Coalition for Women Prisoners. And he did. And it was just such this great moment, more than 20 years later, where it had an impact, I believe, on the legislators as well.
And I think that it had an impact also on the folks in the training component who would come and do the trainings with the women. For me, I'm going to cite there's many relationships that I'll cite. My relationship with the women as experts who just taught me so much. And then also with the community co-trainers who were so committed. It was all volunteer, to come in and teach the Know Your Rights portions of the curriculum. And it is because the trainers were also members of the coalition and they were dedicated to what they were doing, right? And could see that the information that they were giving would help people solve problems, and then it would help them be able to then stay in the game as advocates, right? So that was tremendous. But I want to cite an example. In the beginning, both Anissa and Rhea talked about the role of drugs and addiction as a pathway to women's incarceration. And I didn't have, I had a lot of educating that I needed and learning that I needed about the very deep impact that drug addiction has on people, right? And what it means to be in recovery and how relapse is part of recovery and things, because that would show up in the advocacy training. And I remember in the beginning saying, okay, I have some questions and I need to reach out to somebody. And I reached out to Tina Reynolds because something had happened with our participant. And I wasn't sure that we were handling it right. And I needed to talk it through with somebody. And I remember asking her to go to lunch and so I could have my questions answered. And so to be able to have folks just available like that, that could ask questions, that I could get information, that I could check in with. Robin McGinty was another one. There are many that, when behaviors would show up, that they could say, like, listen, this is part of the road, right? And I really got to be, to me, the one word that I would say is flexible. Flexibility was the key, to just be able to kind of ride the wave and hold space for people in the right way, and to be present and to really advocate for people to be able to just continue no matter what was happening with them. That's what I mean. I just learned so much in the work with Reconnect, but the relationships allowed me to be able to avail myself of the expertise of folks who walked the road and who were also serving as counselors and doing the work. And I just learned so much from that work.
Yeah.
So, Obden, before you take it back, I just have to say one thing, and I know the two of you are going to agree with me, but Anissa, when you said sisters, I thought you meant the real sisters, all the nuns who were an incredible support for the women in prison, for the Coalition for Women Prisoners. I mean, for me, it was Sister Mary Nerney and Sister Marion DeFeast, who was from Rikers Island. Honestly, I feel like without them, none of this would have happened.
Yep.
They were a force for all of us.
Thank you for that reminder, because when I said sisters, I was talking about just women in general, right? But just when you said it, definitely. I had the opportunity to sit on a committee with Sister Mary Nerney, and I had the opportunity to watch her in her fierceness, like work with the women on the inside, bring us back to the coalition, bring it back to the coalition, work with the women in the coalition, bring it back to the women on the inside. And literally, that's how the DVSJA was drafted and passed, with the help of Sister Mary Nerney. And we would
They were guides.
Yeah. Yep, she guided us. She took us right there where we needed to be. So yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Obden. We're gonna turn it back over to you.
Okay, thank you. For the last topic that I wanted to discuss, it is around the legacy of the CWP and the archives as a usable past. So, in my prior question, I was talking about relationships that you developed with the CWP. And, one of the fascinating things about the archives is that it helps us develop our relationship with the past and is always a future-facing project. The best way to, I guess, frame this question is to cite Eve Glazier, who processed the collection and has a blog post out. And like here, she's talking about those who donated the materials to Barnard. She says, and I quote, "The CWP members made it clear that they did not see the archives as a final resting place, but rather as a platform for their material history to take on new lives as resources, foundations, and touchstones for folks involved in the ongoing feminist struggle against the violence of prisons, jails, policing, and carcerality." So, with my last question, I wanted to ask, what are your hopes for the future uses of the CWP? And I think we've been able to do some of this already, but which figures, a part of the coalition, would you like to lift up at this time?
So, I can jump in and start if people don't mind. There's two very specific things that I want to see with the collection. One is I want members of the coalition to continue to build the collection by donating items. And I want to say that this is so important, and I want to say why. And I'm going to pull from an example of women in AIDS advocacy in New York, because I work with Tracy Gartner. Tracy was a member of the coalition and a trainer with Reconnect, and she would teach us all. She's trained people across the state about how the government works, and so that we can do our lobbying more effectively. And so we have occasions where people who write about AIDS activism will often leave out key women leaders and voices in that fight. And, you want to say, well, how is that? But I think there are many women who were involved in that fight that they're no longer living. And unless there's a film, some kind of documentation of their work, and there is a number of documents and films and things out there from the advocacy that they were doing, and people put their hands on it, and a researcher is of the mind that they want to make sure that they include, right, all voices in telling that story, it can get lost. And there are times when I feel like we've been having conversations about books out there, and they're talking about AIDS activism and the Black community in some place, and it just doesn't, like, the story just doesn't feel right. There's people and voices missing. And so what I think is so important about this archive is that for its members to continue to build it with the letters, the notes, the photos, anything that you were doing as a member, to please donate it to the archive so that it's, this is the repository of, the poems that you wrote inside. And then you continue to write when you were part of the coalition about the experiences that you were having, and then some, right? So that when researchers, when the students want to talk about the impact of incarceration, what does mass incarceration and mass criminalization mean for women, for girls, for trans people, for whoever? And they can look to this archive and they can find the material that you've donated, and it will help to tell the collective story, right? So for anybody out there who's part of this conversation, who was a member, I want to say, please go into that box and donate, right? Donate what you have so that it's here and that it can be part of that collective telling of the story, and it can help teach, and that people can learn from your words, from your photos, from your items. I really just want to encourage that. We've had people who've passed away. Kathy Boudin has passed away. Rusty Miller-Hill has passed away. They've done so much. And we need to have part of what they work be a part of this archive. I just want to make that appeal. That's what I want to see. And the other one thing I want to see, then Obden, I've already talked to you about this, is I really would like to see kind of an advisory group of the living members of the coalition who are out there to help guide the conversations and events like this, and be able to work with the students. And all of these folks are still here and still around, and so it can be such a unique living and working archive because its leaders are still living and working, right? And just there's tremendous conversations and work to be done together. And anybody who is a member of the coalition will be a tremendous teacher, as they were to me, right? So that's what I would like to see. And I want to give a shout out to Annette Warren Dickerson, because in the days when we were just trying to figure out, should we pivot the coalition? How can we do this? She was the one that says, we need to assess the impact of the coalition. She's the one that put that idea out first. And from there, we got to do the strategic work to try to say, okay, maybe we're done, right? We've had this tremendous impact, and it's time to sunset. And we learned that Tina Reynolds, who was the head of Worth, Women on the Rise, telling her story, they have an archive at Smith College. And that's what put the idea about, we should have an archive for the coalition. So I just want to say, that's how we kind of got to this point. And it's such a tremendous gift and a tremendous opportunity. And so for anybody out there that has more to add to it, to help it to grow, please, let's do that.
I don't think we need to say anything else, Andrea. You said it. My dream is that this archive continue to live, right? The coalition did not die. It has not gone away. And in some forms, the work does continue, right? And people and students and other community members and young people, right, who will want to organize, can really learn from what's happened throughout the coalition's years. So I'm in total agreement with you. If people are out there and they still have things that I know some of the stuff is hard to, cut yourself away from, because I really didn't want to give up all that I had. But I know now that if I want to go and I want to just take a trip down memory lane, I can go to the archive, right? And I can pick up, kind of like where I left off in the coalition. But I really would hope that, people would learn from it, that it would inspire people to want to do policies, to want to make change, and to be able to say that this archive is a starting point for something new for someone. So yeah, so I'm in total agreement that, and really, let me say this again, thank you for the opportunity to be able to have our coalition archived at Barnard. Because without you guys, we don't know what we would have did, honestly. We'd probably still be thinking about it. But I think this was the best opportunity that we could have came up with for an organization that needed to sunset. So thank you again. Rhea?
So of course I agree. Thank you, Barnard. And thank you, Andrea, for it sounds like you had the idea to spark it at Barnard. So I'm really grateful to you for that in so many ways. And Anissa for giving up your stuff. I actually still have my chart here. So I promised Obden I'd give it up though. He said he'd scan a copy for me. I agree also with everything Andrea said, and I see it in sort of two different, and also Anissa, you kind of both hit the two different areas that I think about what my hopes are. And one is that, hundreds and hundreds of women and men, mostly women, worked on the Coalition for Women and Prisoners a quarter of a century. And the fact that the information can still inform about the needs of women who get caught up in this criminal justice machinery that we have in the United States, that still isn't operating the way it should, that is still more punishment instead of rehabilitation, still not addressing all the needs, and criminalizing behavior that many of us would argue should not be criminalized. So I do hope so much that the bulk of the work can continue to inform for all of the reasons all of us did it. Broadly, I just wanted to share that the skills I developed with specifically the Coalition for Women Prisoners, and is something that I have used to advocate in so many other avenues ever since I left. And I think that the coalition is really a successful example of how to garner the talent, skills, and expertise of people from all walks of life to successfully make changes for others who aren't being heard. And so if the coalition can serve as a model of a successful feminist movement that made change, that others can learn from, and apply it to the many other additional injustices that are present to the world, that is my biggest hope. And I'm going to answer a question nobody else answered, and that was, who would I lift up? I'm going to get verklempt, I'm sorry, but I would lift up the two of you and every other director of the coalition, everyone who led the coalition, everyone who worked on the coalition for the years after I left, because nothing has made me feel so amazing to know that it was in such capable, competent, amazing hands, and it grew to such heights. It's just incredible. So thank you to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rhea.
Thank you.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you all for those wonderful responses. And, the thing I wanted to segue in relation to the creation of this collection that is at the Barnard Archives is, within the current movements that are existing in regards to like the anti-prison movement, what I've found fascinating is this quote that I'm going to share from Ruth Wilson Gilmore, and it really speaks to like all of the work that has been done and how it has become a foundation to the current movements that are happening, where here it says, and this is from a conversation with Daniel Denver of the host of The Dig, in conversation with Robin D.G. Kelly and Olufemi Taiwo. But here's a quote. Once upon a time in the anti-prison movement, there was a concern for making the well-being of prisoners more secure while in prison, and that turned into abolition when we realized that the only way to guarantee the well-being of prisoners is to get them out of prison. And I think we've hit that particular moment in time, and I think it's a segue to the discussion that we're going to have on October 26th with Eve Glazier, Sarah Haley, and Emily Thuma, where there will be discussion about the continued conversation about movements against like women's imprisonment in general, and just talking about like this concept of abolition, which I feel like this was definitely like the proto concept too. So again, I would like to thank you, Anissa Sabour, Rhea Mallet, and Andrea Williams for having the grace and wisdom that was shared with us today, and for just having this wonderful conversation. And at this point, I'm going to check for not conversations, but questions that we may have in the Q&A or comments. And it looks like we have one or two that I can share right now. And one comment that I wanted to highlight is women in our children, the time, still talk about going to Albany to advocate for the anti-shackling bill and DVSJA.
Yes.
That
that was Judy Clark who made that comment, right? And I gotta say, Judy, I love you. Thank you so much for always supporting. And Judy was a member on the inside. All this work was being done, and she is now home and working at Our Children and encouraging other informally incarcerated women to be in movement spaces. So yeah, this is amazing. Thank you, Judy.
Hi, Judy.
And then the other comments we have are all like, thank you for giving this talk. Thank you, very inspiring. And thank you so much for this inspirational and meaningful work. So
can I just say thank you for all of those who joined today?
Yes.
I hope it was like a learning experience. Really, I want to inspire the young folks that are watching this to go to this archive and learn from it, right? Become your own advocates in your own community. Make sure that what you need is being met in your community, and know that you don't have to go the trail that I went. My journey was a different journey. I'm here to help prevent you from walking my journey. So please make sure you go and check out the archives. Thank you. Thank you for joining us.
And I just want to say to people also, thank you. It's a privilege to be in this space. And thank you, those of you who joined us here. I want to say to people, it's very powerful to be a part of a collective, right? To be a part of the coalition. And so if there's anybody out there that you care about issues that are affecting us in this world, but you're not necessarily part of a group, find a group to be a part of, right? We're not going to get the world that we want unless we fight for it. And so if you're not connected, just join up, right? With those who are working to kind of fight for the world that we want to see. There's so much, one, you're needed, right? Your energy, your ideas, your labor is needed. Your being in community together is needed. And there's just so much that we all get from it. We're in times where we have to be together, be in community, and organize and mobilize. And also, like, the movements need to link up, right? Towards those bigger goals. So join a group.
And if you can't find one, start one.
Yeah, exactly. There you go, Rhea. Yep.
Love that. Love that.
I think that is a wonderful way to end this conversation. I again want to thank everyone that is a part of this panel. I want to thank the BCRW, who are our partners for this program. And again, thank you for everyone that was able to come out and attend and listen and bear witness to this conversation. So thank you, and like, I guess, have a wonderful night.
And thank you,
Thank
interpreter.
you.
Thank you, Obden.
Good seeing
Bye.
everybody. Good
Yeah.
night.
Good night.
Bye-bye.